thought-provoking content, well, stay tuned, because we're still looking for it too. Or just join one of Sister Sada Al Farah's classes, because you learn a lot in her classes. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Rayhan, and along with...
Hey, I can introduce myself. My name is Kenyan.
Whatever.
Notice how Kayhan's and Maryam's names start with K, like Kenya starts with K.
Today, we're telling you everything you need to know about Kenya and how Britain colonized them.
At 1/4 white, Rayhan is the most British person you'll ever meet. So basically, it was her homeland that colonized them.
Ugh, whatever. Once upon a time, old Johnny Redcoat landed in Kenya and decided,
who are these losers that have this amazing land? This will be a prime spot for a colony. Perchance, tea shall be their specialty.
Kenya specialized in crop cultivation and livestock keeping, so they weren't really established communities, more like groups of closely related people by blood.
kind of like the Corleones, Crawleys, or even Weasleys. That all changed when my bros at the East India Company were granted a charter. They sailed to Kenya and 10,000 Brits settled there.
When our boy Johnny got there, he realized he was going to have a lot of warming up to do. Get it? Because it was so warm.
So what you're saying basically is that the climate was hot and humid on the coast, hot and dry in the north and east, and the southwest was temperate with some mountains and had like moderate temperatures in different seasons?
Yeah, sure. That's what I was saying. British settlers who came to Kenya because of its resources and comfortable climate forced indigenous farmers onto infertile land or made them work on European-owned farms and plantations.
And that's why the not-so-wonderful colonization came about. Old Johnny Redcoat got to work pretty quickly. He and the East India Company made up a huck's tax and charged people rent for living in their huts. It was pretty much a poll tax, and if people couldn't pay up, they had to work off their debts.
Yes, the tried and true method of forced labor. The East India Company made a land monopoly in Kenya and had total control. Jerks. They exploited the fact that Kenya had tea, and they took over production and shipped loads of it back to the mother country. Never get between a Brit and their tea.
I shall seize all this tea, much like I did in the realm of India.
Did you know that Ahmad tea and Lipton are grown in India and Kenya, and not even in Britain?
What? I've been ripped off? It's not even true British tea?
My favorite, the Brits, made up a legislative council and forced native Kenyans to fight for them on the front lines during British wars.
The poor people forced to fight for Rayhan's friends in Britain were known as the QQs. They made up the majority of the native population. Some were loyalists who supported the British colonization, and some were activists who became known as Meow Meows. Or Mau Maus, depending on how you pronounce it.
Britain dubbed the Mau Maus a terrorist organization, but they're more like freedom fighters, kind of like Hamas.
Finally, you're understanding, you fool. They fought for better wages, more education opportunities, return of stolen lands, and overall African self-determination.
The British government pitched the Mau Maus and QQs loyalists against each other, and the fight between them became known as the Dirty War. Okay, let's talk about some dates. No, not that type of date, this type of date. Kenya was colonized in about 1895, all the way until 1963.
Okay, wait, so old Johnny Redcoat did all of this, but what was the reason? What happened?
Wow. There were more elites now, and they were more divided into social classes. So, as we were saying earlier, when old Johnny Redcoat came along, he put many Kenyans into detention camps.
These camps were often overcrowded, and Kenyans were put through harsh conditions. They were forced to work and do things like build trenches and roads.
The primary source about the Mau Mau detention camps illustrates how detainees were forced into the bottom of the hierarchy through harsh treatment, forced labor, and dehumanizing conditions. It reflects the colonial system's deliberate effort to strip them of autonomy and dignity, reinforcing racial and political subjugation. This control maintained a colonial power structure by positioning the detainees as powerless subjects.
They were also starved and often died because of malnutrition and disease.
Because of the absence of over 1 million Kenyans from Kenyan society, everyone had to redistribute jobs and reorganize their familial structures and just the way they run things in general.
This forever left a mark on the distribution of jobs in Kenya because the attempt to remain normal after so many years, like so many Kenyans have been in prison.
When women started to take up more jobs, Britain started to force a new patriarchy and forced women to have more domestic roles despite their previous involvement in hunting and agriculture.
This only set Kenyan society back even more because while women and men were trying to take over jobs of misplaced Kenyans, Britain was forcing them to fall into more patriarchal
roles.
So when Britain came and colonized them, they chose the Kenyan elites through their education levels and even allowed some Kenyans to be educated in order to serve the government.
The Western type of education that they got gave them a high position of power in colonial Kenya, and they stayed in control even after Kenya gained independence.
The Devonshire White Paper or Devonshire Declaration was a document written in 1923 by the colonial secretary Victor Cavendish, 9th Duke of Devonshire, regarding the status of settlers and natives in the Kenya colony and East Africa more broadly. The declaration blocked the move towards self-government advocated by the colonialists, and in its place advocated a policy of trusteeship, whereby the imperial state would protect the interests of Africans.
But what does it mean that they were never actually free? Well, they were never really free because the Kenyan elite stayed in control even after independence, and it was and still is a strict government.
The monuments. We were conned at independence. We handed over to the people who were subservient to the colonial authorities. I do a lot of social media activism, and my premise is that Kenya has never gotten independence. The thread that I did before the arrest that traced this all the way from colonial chiefs to the current political elite. And their intermarriages and their linkages and their business linkages and that kind of thing. And it went well because Kenya...
So, in summary, even after gaining independence, elites took all the control and didn't actually provide the Kenyans with independence, meaning Britain left behind a social hierarchy that stayed even after they left and is present all the way until today.
Essentially, the concept of wealth changed. Traditionally, Kenyans focused more on hunting and gathering, and the richer people were the ones that had more livestock and larger scale farms. Shout out, things fall apart. Oh, sorry, I don't know what came over me. Anyways, hence people changed that, and the upper class became investors and businessmen, which introduced a completely new way of life for natives. This made the gap between the rich and the poor huge, and it put Europeans or European-style people on top.
Yeah, our friends the Redcoats made a new economic policy where they reorganized QQ's land and resources, which forced them to become laborers to sustain themselves. This made them the lower social class, since they are basically indentured servants.
Yeah, you definitely know a thing or two about indentured servitude. These sucky working conditions are what sparked the Meow Meow Rebellion, since some of the main things they fought for were higher wages and return of alienated lands.
Okay, so personally what I learned from this is that the Brits were jerks.
Bozos.
Punks.
They stink. Honestly, they should just shower more often.
They basically just trotted into Kenya on their high horse and took them over.
Yeah, they left behind so much negative influence that Kenya and so many other places in Africa are still suffering till today.
Remember, kids, never colonize people. It's not nice.
Totally mean. We also learned how Britain and other colonial powers influenced countries in Africa till today, and how just because they wanted money and resources, they put African countries' whole structures at stake. All this for their stupid mother country.
Oh my God, you want to talk about mother? Oh, you want to talk about mother?
Okay, but in reality, they did do some good for the world. But now, you know what they did in Africa, and that it was mostly bad.